Mike Thompson's bloodied hands trembled against Luna's swollen belly, her labored breathing echoing through the Wyoming wilderness like a prayer for mercy. The 400-pound grizzly's amber eyes locked onto his, not with the fury he expected, but with desperate, unmistakable trust. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not again. Dr. Sarah Chen stumbled backward, her medical kit scattering across the frost-covered ground as the massive bear shifted, revealing twin cubs trapped in an impossible breech birth. "Jesus Christ, Mike," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She's been in labor for 3 days." The forest held its breath as Mike recognized the distinctive scar on Luna's left ear, the same mark he'd seen 15 years ago when she was just a cub, clinging to life in his grandfather's gentle hands. His radio crackled with Supervisor Davis's ultimatum. "Choose now, Thompson. Your career or her life. You have 10 minutes before I call this in." Time was hemorrhaging away like Luna's strength, and Mike faced the choice that would either save 3 lives or destroy everything he'd worked for. What price was worth paying for a promise made to a dying grandfather and a trust that transcended species? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The crisp September morning had started like any other in Yellowstone's backcountry, with Mike Thompson adjusting his worn leather gloves as golden aspen leaves drifted across the trail. At 46, he moved through these mountains with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent 15 years learning every creek bed and game trail, every seasonal migration pattern and territorial boundary. His grandfather's Cherokee blood had gifted him an intuitive understanding of wildlife that no textbook could teach, though the Park Service bureaucrats preferred their rangers stick to regulation protocols these days. Mike's weathered pickup truck sat parked at the trailhead, its bed loaded with monitoring equipment and emergency supplies. Budget cuts had reduced ranger patrols to skeleton crews, forcing each officer to cover twice the territory with half the resources. At 15 years of service, Mike needed 5 more to qualify for his full pension, a fact that weighed heavily on his mind since his wife Emma's death 3 years ago had left him with crushing medical debt and an empty cabin that echoed with memories. Supervisor James Davis, 58 and built like the Marine he'd once been, ruled the district with military precision and zero tolerance for deviation from protocol. Their relationship had grown increasingly strained as Davis implemented cost-cutting measures that Mike believed compromised wildlife safety. What Mike didn't know was that Davis carried a secret burden. He'd been Mike's father's best friend and partner the day Robert Thompson died trying to rescue an injured bear in 1987. Davis's harsh adherence to rules masked a desperate fear of losing another Thompson to the wilderness. Dr. Sarah Chen had arrived in Jackson Hole 6 months earlier, trading her lucrative veterinary practice in San Francisco for volunteer work with the park's wildlife rehabilitation program. At 52, recently divorced and estranged from her adult daughter, Sarah sought redemption through service to creatures that couldn't judge her past failures. Her expertise in large animal emergency medicine made her invaluable to the understaffed Park Service, though her unmarked Honda Civic looked out of place among the ranch trucks and government vehicles. Dorothy Dot Williams embodied the old Wyoming spirit that was rapidly disappearing from the changing West. At 73, the retired nurse lived alone on her late husband's ranch bordering the park, her days filled with caring for injured wildlife and dispensing coffee and wisdom to anyone who knocked on her door. Since losing Earl to a heart attack 2 years ago, she'd adopted Mike as the grandson she'd never had, worrying about his isolation and encouraging him to find purpose beyond his grief. The mountains themselves seemed to hold secrets in their ancient granite faces and deep pine shadows. Yellowstone's ecosystem balanced on knife-edge relationships between predator and prey, human management and wild instinct, federal regulation and local wisdom. In this landscape where grizzlies still roamed free and winters could kill the unprepared, every decision carried weight, and every choice between following orders and following conscience could determine who lived and who died. None of them knew that within 72 hours, these separate lives would converge around a laboring bear whose trust in humans would test everything they believed about duty, compassion, and the true meaning of protection. The first sign of trouble came during Mike's routine morning patrol on Tuesday, when he spotted fresh grizzly tracks near Cascade Creek that seemed oddly erratic. The prints showed a large female, maybe 350–400 pounds, but her gait pattern suggested restlessness, frequent stops, circling behaviors, and gouged earth where she'd been digging. Mike knelt beside the clearest track, his grandfather's voice echoing in his memory. When a bear changes her pattern, she's telling you something important. Following the trail upstream, Mike discovered Luna resting in a secluded grove of ancient pines. He recognized her immediately by the distinctive crescent-shaped scar on her left ear, a mark he'd helped create 15 years ago when she was just a starving 6-month-old cub caught in an illegal snare. Mike had been fresh out of ranger training then, working under his mentor Jim Hawkins, when they'd found her clinging to life beside her dead mother. The emergency surgery to remove the snare had left that permanent scar, but it had also created something unprecedented, a wild grizzly that associated humans with rescue rather than threat. Now, Luna lay on her side beneath the pines, her massive form rising and falling with labored breathing. Her belly was visibly distended, and she kept shifting position restlessly, classic signs of advanced pregnancy. Mike maintained a respectful 50-yard distance as he observed her behavior through binoculars, noting the way she would stand, walk in tight circles, then lie down again. His heart sank as he realized what he was witnessing. Luna was experiencing dystocia, a potentially fatal birthing complication. That evening, Mike called Dr. Sarah Chen from his cabin, describing Luna's condition in clinical detail. Sarah's response was immediate and grim. In domestic animals, dystocia has about a 60% mortality rate for both mother and offspring without surgical intervention, she explained, her voice tight with concern. In the wild, where stress levels are higher and medical intervention is impossible, that rate jumps to nearly 80%. If she's been in labor for more than 24 hours, we're looking at a medical emergency. Mike's request to monitor Luna more closely was met with immediate resistance from Supervisor Davis during their Wednesday morning briefing. "Absolutely not, Thompson," Davis said, his weathered face stern beneath his regulation Park Service cap. "Our policy is clear: no intervention in natural processes. Nature takes its course, period. We're observers, not participants." "But she's not just any bear, sir," Mike protested. "Luna has a history with our department. We saved her life once before. She trusts us." "That's exactly why you need to stay away," Davis snapped. "Any bear that's lost its natural fear of humans is a liability. We can't have rangers playing veterinarian with dangerous wildlife. One incident report ends your career, Thompson. Don't forget you've got 5 years left for your pension." The mention of his pension hit Mike like a physical blow. After Emma's death, that security was all that stood between him and financial ruin. Medical bills had already consumed most of their savings, and his modest ranger salary barely covered the mortgage on their cabin. But as he returned to Luna's location that afternoon and saw her condition deteriorating, financial security seemed less important than the life struggling before him. By Wednesday evening, Luna's distress was visible even from a distance. She hadn't moved from her position under the pines in over 6 hours, and her breathing had become shallow and rapid. Mike contacted Dr. Chen again, describing the worsening symptoms. "She needs help, Sarah. Without intervention, both Luna and her cubs will die within the next 24 hours. Dr. Chen arrived Thursday morning in her Honda Civic loaded with veterinary supplies, her determination overriding the obvious risks to her own career. As a volunteer, she had even less job security than Mike, but her Hippocratic oath extended to all creatures under her care. Together, they observed Luna from the tree line, noting the clear signs of obstructed labor, continuous but ineffective contractions, maternal exhaustion, and the ominous stillness that preceded systemic failure. "We need to call this in," Sarah said quietly, her medical training warring with the reality of Park Service protocol. In a hospital, this would be an emergency cesarean section. Out here, we're looking at a field procedure with no backup, no surgical suite, no post-operative care facilities. Before Mike could respond, the crackle of his radio announced Supervisor Davis's arrival. The older man's face was grim as he surveyed the scene through his own binoculars. "Stand down, both of you. I've had headquarters breathing down my neck about liability issues all week. The last thing we need is dead rangers because someone thought they could play Dr. Doolittle with a 400-pound predator." "She's dying, James," Mike said, using his supervisor's first name for the first time in years. "We can't just stand here and watch." "That's exactly what we can and will do," Davis replied, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "Dr. Chen, I'm ordering you to pack up your equipment and leave park property immediately. Thompson, you're to maintain observation distance only. No contact, no intervention, no exceptions." As Davis prepared to leave, he turned back to Mike with an expression that mixed authority with something deeper, a pain that Mike couldn't quite identify. "Some lessons come at too high a price, son. Trust me on this one." Alone with Sarah after Davis departed, Mike felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Luna's condition was clearly critical now, her breathing more labored, her massive body trembling with exhaustion. The image of the scared cub he'd helped save 15 years ago superimposed itself over the dying mother before him. "What would your grandfather do?" Sarah asked quietly, having heard Mike speak of the Cherokee medicine man who'd raised him after his parents' divorce. Mike closed his eyes, remembering weathered hands teaching him to read animal behavior, a gentle voice explaining that sometimes the greatest courage meant knowing when to act despite the consequences. "Grandfather always said that animals choose who they trust. When they make that choice, it creates a responsibility that goes deeper than man's laws." As Thursday evening approached and Luna's breathing became increasingly shallow, Mike faced the decision that would define not just his career but his character. The radio on his belt remained silent, Davis presumably confident that his orders would be followed. But in the gathering twilight, with Luna's amber eyes reflecting a trust that had endured 15 years, Mike realized that some bonds transcended bureaucracy, and some promises to the dying demanded payment regardless of the cost. The choice was no longer between his career and Luna's life. It was between the man he'd been trained to be and the man his grandfather had raised him to become. The confrontation came at dawn Friday morning, with mist still clinging to the valley floor like ghostly fingers reluctant to release their grip on the earth. Mike had spent a sleepless night in his truck, monitoring Luna's deteriorating condition through night vision binoculars, watching her contractions grow weaker and less frequent. When Davis's government SUV pulled up behind him at 6:47 a.m., Mike knew the moment of reckoning had arrived. "Step out of the vehicle, Thompson." Davis's voice carried the cold authority of 20 years in federal law enforcement. His uniform was crisp despite the early hour, his jaw set in the rigid line Mike had come to recognize as non-negotiable. Behind him, 2 additional park rangers, Martinez and O'Brien, stood at attention, their presence making clear this wasn't a friendly morning chat. Mike emerged slowly from his truck, his joints stiff from the uncomfortable night, his eyes never leaving Luna's motionless form 50 yards away. She's dying, James. Look at her breathing, maybe 6 breaths per minute. Her cubs are dying inside her while we stand here playing politics. Politics? Davis's weathered face flushed red. This is about following federal regulations that exist for good reasons, Thompson, reasons written in blood by people who came before us and learned hard lessons about the consequences of good intentions. The older supervisor stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried more menace than shouting. You think you're the first ranger to face this choice? You think you're special because you've got some mystical connection with wildlife? Let me tell you something, son. Your grandfather's Cherokee wisdom doesn't trump federal law, and your guilty conscience doesn't override public safety protocols. Mike felt something cold settle in his chest at the mention of his grandfather. What would you know about my grandfather's wisdom? You never met him. Davis's expression shifted, pain flickering across his features like lightning behind storm clouds. I knew your father, Mike. I knew him better than you think. Robert Thompson was my best friend, my partner, and the finest ranger who ever wore this uniform. He died because he thought his heart was bigger than regulations, just like you're doing right now. The revelation hit Mike like a physical blow. His father had been killed in a bear attack when Mike was 12, but the official reports had always been vague about the circumstances. Now, seeing the raw grief in Davis's eyes, Mike began to understand the deeper currents that had shaped their relationship. I was supposed to be his backup that night, Davis continued, his voice cracking slightly. November 15, 1987. We got a report of an injured grizzly near Tower Falls, a female with cubs who'd been hit by a poacher's bullet. Your father insisted on going in alone because I wasn't fit for duty that night. I'd been drinking again, celebrating my ex-wife's remarriage, drowning my sorrows like a damn fool. Martinez and O'Brien exchanged uncomfortable glances as their supervisor's composure cracked. This was clearly more personal history than they'd expected to witness on a routine enforcement call. Robert went in alone to help that bear, Davis pressed on. She was in exactly the same condition as this one, dying, desperate, dangerous. He got too close, trusted too much, and she killed him in her pain and confusion. I found his body 6 hours later, half-eaten, because I was too drunk to answer his radio calls for backup. Mike stared at his supervisor with new understanding, seeing 36 years of buried guilt and self-recrimination written in the deep lines around Davis's eyes. The harsh enforcement of regulations, the zero-tolerance policies, the rigid adherence to protocol, it all made terrible sense now. So, you see, Thompson, Davis said, straightening his shoulders and resuming his official demeanor, I won't lose another member of the Thompson family to these damn bears. I won't carry that burden twice in one lifetime. You're going to step away from this animal right now, or I'll place you under arrest for violation of federal wildlife protection statutes. Before Mike could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted the tense standoff. Dr. Sarah Chen's Honda Civic bounced up the rough Forest Service road, her medical supplies clearly visible through the rear window. She parked 30 yards away and approached the group with the confident stride of someone accustomed to asserting authority in crisis situations. Gentlemen, she said, nodding curtly to each of them. I've been monitoring the situation remotely, and I'm here to inform you that we're facing an imminent medical emergency that transcends jurisdictional concerns. That bear is approximately 4 to 6 hours from complete systemic failure. Davis turned his attention to the veterinarian, his expression hardening further. Dr. Chen, I specifically ordered you to leave park property yesterday. Your presence here constitutes trespassing on federal land. Actually, Supervisor Davis, my volunteer credentials with the National Park Service give me authority to respond to wildlife medical emergencies within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, Sarah replied calmly, producing an official-looking document from her jacket pocket. This situation clearly falls under those parameters. Mike watched the bureaucratic chess match with growing frustration, acutely aware that Luna's labored breathing was becoming increasingly shallow. Every minute spent in official posturing brought her closer to death, along with the cubs she carried. The irony wasn't lost on him that his father had died trying to save a bear in similar circumstances, and now he faced the same choice that had cost Robert Thompson his life. "Look at her," Mike said quietly, interrupting the legal debate. "Just look at her, James. She's not some abstract policy problem or liability statistic. She's a living creature in agony, and she trusts us enough to let us help. That trust comes with responsibility." Davis followed Mike's gaze to Luna's motionless form, and for a moment his official facade cracked again. Mike caught a glimpse of the young ranger who'd lost his best friend, the man who'd spent decades punishing himself for a single night's failure. "The regulations exist for good reasons," Davis said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Animal attacks on park personnel, liability issues, public safety concerns, all valid," Sarah interjected. "But there's also legal precedent for emergency intervention in cases where human activity has created dependency relationships with wildlife. Luna's previous rescue and rehabilitation created exactly that relationship." The sound of Luna's distressed breathing carried across the clearing, a harsh rasping that spoke of systems beginning to fail. Mike made his decision in that moment, not with his head but with something deeper, the same instinct that had guided his grandfather's gentle hands and his father's brave heart. "I'm going to help her," he said simply, walking toward his truck to retrieve his emergency kit. "You can arrest me afterward if you need to, James, but I won't stand here and watch her die when I have the knowledge and tools to save her." Davis's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, protocol demanding that he call for additional backup to restrain his subordinate. But as he watched Mike approach Luna with the same careful confidence Robert Thompson had shown 36 years earlier, the supervisor found himself frozen between duty and friendship, between federal regulations and human decency. "Mike," Davis called out, his voice heavy with emotion and authority in equal measure, "if you take one more step toward that bear, I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest. Your career will be over, your pension gone, your future destroyed. Is saving one animal worth sacrificing everything you've worked for?" Mike paused at the edge of the clearing, Luna's amber eyes visible through the morning mist. In that moment, he heard his grandfather's voice as clearly as if the old Cherokee healer were standing beside him. "Some choices define who you are, grandson. Choose well." "Some things matter more than a paycheck, James," Mike replied, stepping into the clearing. "Some promises can't be broken, even by federal law." Behind him, Davis reached for his radio with trembling fingers, knowing that the call he was about to make would destroy the career of Robert Thompson's son, and wondering if he was about to relive the worst night of his life all over again. Mike's first step into the clearing felt like crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. Luna lifted her massive head slightly at his approach, her amber eyes tracking his movement with an alertness that surprised him, given her weakened condition. Behind him, he heard Davis speaking urgently into his radio, the words Code 7 and unauthorized wildlife contact carrying across the morning air like a death sentence for his career. "Easy, girl," Mike murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle cadence his grandfather had used with wounded animals decades earlier. "I know you remember me. I know you understand I'm here to help." Dr. Sarah Chen moved parallel to Mike, her medical bag in hand, ignoring the increasingly frantic radio chatter from the Park Service vehicles. Her professional assessment was swift and alarming. Luna's gums were pale, indicating significant blood loss, and her breathing pattern suggested she was entering the early stages of shock. "Mike, we need to work fast. Her blood pressure is dropping, and those cubs won't survive much longer without oxygen." Luna's response to their presence was unlike anything the watching rangers had ever witnessed. Rather than displaying the territorial aggression typical of a grizzly sow, she seemed to relax slightly, her breathing becoming marginally less labored, as if their proximity brought comfort rather than stress. Martinez whispered to O'Brien, "I've never seen anything like this. It's like she's asking for help." The medical examination revealed the full scope of the crisis. Luna was carrying twins, but both cubs were positioned incorrectly for natural birth. A breech presentation that made delivery impossible without intervention. Dr. Chen's experienced hands detected the outline of tiny bodies through Luna's distended abdomen, noting the lack of movement that indicated fetal distress. "We're looking at a complete obstetric emergency," she told Mike quietly. "Without immediate intervention, all three will be dead within hours." As Mike began unpacking the emergency medical supplies he'd assembled, Dorothy Dot Williams's ancient Ford pickup rattled into the clearing, its arrival as unexpected as it was welcome. The 73-year-old retired nurse emerged with surprising agility, carrying a worn leather medical bag that had seen decades of service in rural Wyoming emergencies. "Heard the radio chatter on my scanner," she announced matter-of-factly. "Figured you boys might need someone who's delivered babies in less than ideal circumstances." Davis watched in growing alarm as his controlled situation devolved into what looked like a folk medicine convention. "Mrs. Williams, I'm ordering you to leave federal property immediately. This situation is already compromised enough without civilian interference." Dot fixed the supervisor with a look that had cowed 3 generations of Wyoming ranchers. "Son, I was delivering babies and saving lives in these mountains when you were still in diapers. That bear needs help, and these folks are going to give it to her, regulations be damned. You can arrest us all afterward if it makes you feel better." The next hour unfolded like a carefully choreographed emergency procedure, despite taking place in a wilderness clearing rather than a sterile operating room. Dr. Chen took the lead, her veterinary expertise translating remarkably well to the unique challenges of treating a wild grizzly in labor. Mike served as her primary assistant, his intimate knowledge of Luna's behavior allowing him to anticipate and respond to her needs in ways that amazed the medical team. Luna's cooperation was nothing short of miraculous. She allowed the humans to position her for optimal access, accepted the insertion of IV lines for fluid replacement, and even permitted Dr. Chen to perform a thorough internal examination to assess the position of the cubs. "It's as if she understands exactly what we're trying to do," Sarah marveled, carefully maneuvering to assist with the breached presentation. The first cub emerged after 45 minutes of careful manipulation, a tiny, wet bundle of fur that immediately began mewing for its mother. Luna's response was instant and profound. She lifted her massive head to inspect her newborn, her tongue gently cleaning the birth fluid from the cub's face. The maternal bonding was so complete and natural that even the skeptical park rangers found themselves moved by the scene. But the second birth proved more complicated. The cub was larger and more severely malpositioned, requiring Dr. Chen to make life-or-death decisions about the level of intervention she could safely perform in field conditions. "I need to perform a partial manual extraction," she told Mike, her hands already moving with professional precision. "The umbilical cord is compressed, which means we have maybe minutes before brain damage occurs." Luna's trust during this critical phase was absolute and heartbreaking. As Dr. Chen worked to save her second cub, the massive bear actually seemed to push in coordination with the veterinarian's efforts, as if understanding that their goals were aligned. Dot Williams monitored vital signs with equipment that looked primitive but functioned perfectly, calling out blood pressure and heart rate readings that helped guide the emergency procedures. The second cub's birth was touch and go. When it finally emerged, it was clearly smaller than its sibling and showed no immediate signs of life. Mike's heart sank as he recognized the stillness that indicated potential stillbirth. But Dr. Chen immediately began resuscitation procedures adapted from neonatal protocols. "Come on, little one," she murmured, performing tiny chest compressions and clearing the cub's airway with delicate precision. After 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, the clearing was silent except for Luna's anxious breathing and Dr. Chen's quiet encouragements to the motionless cub. Then, like a miracle, the tiny creature drew its first breath, followed by a weak but unmistakable cry for its mother. Luna's response was immediate. She gathered both cubs close to her body, her massive paws handling them with impossible gentleness. The immediate medical emergency was over, but the broader crisis was just beginning. Davis's radio had been crackling with increasingly urgent communications from park headquarters, and the supervisor's face was grim as he processed orders from supervisors who hadn't witnessed the remarkable scene in the clearing. "Yellowstone Command is sending a full incident response team," he told the group quietly. "Criminal investigators, federal prosecutors, the whole works. This situation has escalated beyond my authority to contain. Dr." Chen was documenting the births with photographs and detailed medical notes, aware that the unprecedented nature of the human-wildlife cooperation would require extensive justification. "We've just witnessed something that challenges everything we think we know about wild animal behavior," she said, watching Luna nurse her newborns with obvious contentment. "This level of trust and cooperation between a wild grizzly and humans is essentially unprecedented in the scientific literature." But even as they celebrated the successful births, new complications were emerging. The smaller cub, while alive, was clearly struggling more than its sibling. Dr. Chen's examination revealed what appeared to be developmental issues, possible vision problems, and motor coordination difficulties that would make survival in the wild extremely challenging. "This little one is going to need ongoing care," she told Mike quietly. In the wild, cubs with these kinds of disabilities rarely survive their first winter. Luna seemed to sense the difference in her cubs as well. While she was attentive to both, Mike noticed that she spent extra time nuzzling and positioning the smaller cub, as if aware of its greater vulnerability. The sight of the massive predator showing such tender care for her disabled offspring was profoundly moving, even to the hardened park rangers who had initially opposed the intervention. As word of the unusual births spread through the Park Service's communication network, the clearing began to attract additional attention. A news helicopter appeared on the distant horizon, drawn by scanner traffic and the growing sense that something significant was happening in the Yellowstone backcountry. Mike watched its approach with growing dread, knowing that media attention would make it impossible for the Park Service to handle the situation quietly. "This is about to become a circus," Davis said grimly, his radio crackling with demands for situation reports from multiple federal agencies. "Mike, I want you to know that whatever happens next, what you did here today, what all of you did, it was the right thing, but right doesn't always protect you from the consequences." The supervisor's admission carried the weight of 36 years of regret and professionally enforced detachment from the wildlife he'd sworn to protect. For the first time since Mike had known him, Davis looked like a man wrestling with conscience rather than regulations, torn between the duty that had defined his career and the undeniable evidence that sometimes breaking rules served a higher purpose. As the helicopter circled closer and additional vehicles appeared on the Forest Service roads leading to their location, Mike knelt beside Luna and her newborns one last time. The bear looked up at him with those remarkable amber eyes, and he could swear he saw recognition and gratitude in their depths. Whatever consequences awaited him, he knew with absolute certainty that he had honored both his grandfather's teachings and his father's memory. The storm that was about to break over their heads would test everything they believed about duty, compassion, and the complex relationship between human authority and natural wisdom. But in that moment, watching Luna contentedly nursing her cubs while the disabled youngster struggled bravely to keep up with its stronger sibling, Mike felt a peace he hadn't known since Emma's death. Some prices were worth paying. Some promises transcended the cost of keeping them. The storm broke exactly 47 minutes after the cubs were born, arriving not as weather but as a convoy of federal vehicles that transformed the peaceful clearing into a bureaucratic battlefield. Mike barely had time to ensure Luna and her newborns were stable before the thunderous roar of helicopters shattered the mountain's silence. The lead chopper bore the distinctive markings of the Department of Interior's Criminal Investigation Division, while a second aircraft carried what appeared to be media equipment and camera crews who had somehow intercepted the emergency communications. Regional Director Patricia Hayes emerged from the first government SUV like a general surveying a conquered territory, her expression carved from granite and her gray suit incongruously formal for the wilderness setting. Behind her came a parade of federal investigators, wildlife enforcement officers, and legal advisors whose collective presence transformed Mike's act of compassion into what clearly resembled a federal crime scene. Hayes surveyed the situation with cold efficiency, her eyes taking in Luna nursing her cubs, the scattered medical equipment, and the small group of civilians who had orchestrated the unauthorized intervention. "Supervisor Davis," Hayes said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, "I want a complete situation report, starting with how a routine wildlife observation escalated into a violation of multiple federal statutes." Her gaze fixed on Mike with laser intensity. "Ranger Thompson, you are hereby suspended from duty pending a full investigation into your conduct. You will surrender your badge, weapon, and radio immediately." The media helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their cameras capturing every moment of the confrontation for what was clearly becoming a national news story. Mike could see reporters setting up equipment beyond the tree line, their presence turning Luna's birthing site into an unwanted spectacle. The irony wasn't lost on him that his attempt to save lives in private was now becoming a public circus that would likely traumatize the very animals he'd tried to protect. Dr. Sarah Chen stepped forward with professional composure, her medical documentation in hand. "Director Hayes, before any disciplinary action is taken, I think you need to understand the medical realities of what occurred here. Without immediate intervention, we would have lost 3 lives, a 400-pound female grizzly and her twin cubs. The successful outcome validates the decision to act." "Dr. Chen," Hayes replied icily, "the outcome is irrelevant to the fact that federal wildlife protection protocols were violated. We don't make exceptions to regulations based on emotional decisions or veterinary opinions. These protocols exist because previous rangers made similar, compassionate choices that resulted in human deaths and increased public danger." The reference to human deaths hit Davis like a physical blow, and Mike watched his supervisor's face crumble as 36 years of suppressed guilt rose to the surface. "She's talking about your father," Davis whispered to Mike, his voice barely audible above the helicopter noise. "She's talking about Robert." Luna herself seemed distressed by the chaos surrounding her peaceful moment with her newborns. The massive bear lifted her head repeatedly, her ears flattening against the mechanical noise overhead, her protective instincts clearly triggered by the perceived threat to her vulnerable cubs. Dr. Chen noticed the stress response immediately and moved to position herself between Luna and the growing crowd of federal personnel. "We need to clear this area," Sarah announced with medical authority. "The mother is showing signs of postpartum stress that could trigger defensive behavior. A 400-pound grizzly sow with newborn cubs is exponentially more dangerous when she perceives threats to her offspring." but Hayes seemed more concerned with establishing federal authority than animal welfare. "Ranger Thompson, you are under arrest for violation of the Endangered Species Act, failure to follow direct orders, and endangering federal personnel." She nodded to two wildlife enforcement officers who began approaching Mike with handcuffs, their movement causing Luna to rise to her feet with a warning growl that made everyone in the clearing freeze. The standoff that followed was unlike anything in Park Service history. Luna positioned herself protectively over her cubs, her massive form radiating the lethal potential that made grizzly bears apex predators. But rather than displaying random aggression, her attention remained focused on the uniformed officers approaching Mike, as if she understood exactly who represented a threat to the human who had saved her cubs' lives. Dorothy Williams chose that moment to assert herself with the fearless authority of someone who had survived 7 decades in Wyoming's unforgiving wilderness. "You federal jackasses are about to get someone killed," she announced, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "That bear isn't showing defensive behavior. She's showing protective behavior. There's a difference, and if you don't understand it, you've got no business making decisions about wildlife management." The elderly nurse's intervention created a moment of hesitation that Mike used to address Luna directly, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "Easy, girl. These people aren't going to hurt your babies. I need you to stay calm for them, okay?" Luna's ears pricked forward at his familiar voice, and she slowly settled back into a protective position over her cubs, though her eyes never left the approaching officers. Hayes watched this exchange with obvious displeasure, clearly frustrated that a civilian had more influence over the situation than federal authority. "Mrs. Williams, you are trespassing on federal property and interfering with a criminal investigation. Officers, place her under arrest as well." The attempted arrest of Dorothy Williams proved to be the catalyst that transformed local support into open rebellion. The news helicopters captured every moment as federal officers moved toward the elderly nurse, creating images that would dominate national news cycles within hours. But before the arrest could be completed, the sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of unexpected reinforcements. A convoy of pickup trucks flying American flags and bearing Wyoming license plates rolled into the clearing, carrying ranchers, retired Park Service employees, and local citizens who had monitored the situation through emergency radio scanners. Their presence transformed the dynamic from federal authorities versus individual lawbreakers into something approaching a civil rights confrontation, with Luna and her cubs at the center of a debate about conscience versus compliance. Leading this civilian response was Thomas Crow Feather, an elderly Shoshone elder whose presence on traditional tribal lands carried legal weight that federal authorities couldn't simply dismiss. At 81 years old, Crow Feather moved with the dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating the complex relationship between indigenous rights and federal law. His weathered hands carried a ceremonial staff, and his presence immediately commanded respect even from Hayes's federal team. "This land remembers older laws than yours," Crow Feather announced, his voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. "The Bear Woman has chosen her protector, and the spirits have blessed this birth. You would arrest a man for honoring the sacred bond between healer and patient?" Hayes found herself facing a situation her federal training had never prepared her for, a confrontation involving not just individual lawbreakers, but potentially significant civil rights and indigenous sovereignty issues that could create national political complications. The media helicopters continued circling overhead, their cameras capturing every word and gesture for an audience that was growing larger by the minute. Meanwhile, Luna's condition was becoming a growing concern for Dr. Chen, who observed increasing signs of stress in both the mother and her newborns. The smaller cub, in particular, seemed to be struggling with the chaos, its breathing becoming labored and its movements less coordinated than its stronger sibling. "We need to resolve this situation quickly," Sarah told Mike urgently. The stress is affecting the cub's ability to nurse, and the disabled youngster can't afford to lose any more strength. The medical crisis provided Mike with an opportunity to demonstrate the depth of Luna's trust in him. Ignoring the federal officers and their handcuffs, he moved slowly toward the Bear family, his voice calm and reassuring despite the pandemonium around them. Luna watched his approach with alert but non-aggressive attention, allowing him to kneel within arm's reach of her cubs, a display of interspecies trust that left even the hardened federal agents speechless. "Look at this," Mike said quietly, his words carrying clearly in the sudden hush that fell over the clearing. "Look at the choice she's making. She could kill any of us without effort, but she chooses to trust instead. That trust comes with responsibility, Director Hayes. It comes with an obligation that goes deeper than federal regulations." The smaller cub struggled to its feet as Mike approached, its movements unsteady but determined. When it took a faltering step toward him, Luna made no move to intervene, instead watching with what appeared to be approval as Mike gently examined the youngster's condition. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras and would soon be broadcast around the world. A wild grizzly bear allowing a human to handle her disabled newborn while federal officers waited with handcuffs. Hayes faced a decision that would define not only Mike's fate, but potentially reshape federal wildlife management policy. The images being broadcast live showed federal authorities preparing to arrest a man for saving lives, while a disabled bear cub struggled to survive in his gentle hands. Public opinion was already shifting dramatically, with social media exploding in support of the ranger who had chosen compassion over compliance. "Stand down," Hayes finally ordered her officers, though her voice carried frustration rather than capitulation. "We'll handle this through administrative channels rather than criminal prosecution." The decision was clearly tactical rather than moral, but it provided the breathing space needed to address Luna's immediate medical needs. As the federal officers reluctantly holstered their handcuffs and the crowd of supporters began to cheer, Mike remained focused on the tiny cub in his hands. The youngster was clearly struggling, its breathing shallow and its temperature lower than normal. Dr. Chen moved to assist with another examination, her professional assessment confirming their worst fears about the cub's long-term survival prospects. In that moment of crisis and triumph, with helicopters circling overhead and cameras capturing every gesture, Mike made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. Looking up at Director Hayes with quiet determination, he spoke words that would echo in federal courtrooms and congressional hearings for years to come. "If you want to arrest someone for choosing life over law, then arrest me. But this cub needs ongoing care, and Luna has chosen me to provide it. I won't abandon that trust no matter what it costs me." The administrative machinery of federal bureaucracy moved with ruthless efficiency once Director Hayes made her decision to pursue disciplinary rather than criminal action. Within 72 hours of the birth, Mike found himself stripped of his badge, his weapon, and his access to the cabin that had been his home for 15 years. The eviction notice arrived with the cold formality of government letterhead, giving him exactly 14 days to vacate federal housing and remove all personal belongings from park property. The irony was devastating. While social media exploded with support for his actions, while news outlets hailed him as a hero who chose compassion over compliance, Mike faced the complete destruction of everything he had built since Emma's death. His suspension without pay meant the immediate loss of health insurance that was still covering Emma's medical debt, while the threat of termination would eliminate his pension just 5 years short of full vesting. At 46, with no other marketable skills beyond wildlife management, he was staring at financial ruin. Dr. Sarah Chen's situation was equally precarious. Her volunteer status provided no protection against federal retaliation, and within days of the incident, she received official notification that her access to park facilities had been permanently revoked, Her veterinary practice in Jackson Hole, already struggling due to her divorce settlement, couldn't survive the loss of Park Service contracts that had provided nearly 30% of her income. The woman who had saved 3 lives found herself facing bankruptcy and professional exile. But it was Luna's situation that tormented Mike the most. The disabled cub, whom he had privately named Hope after his grandfather's Cherokee word for perseverance, was failing to thrive despite its mother's devoted care. Dr. Chen's remote monitoring through telephoto lenses revealed that the youngster was falling behind developmentally, unable to keep up with its stronger sibling during Luna's daily movements to find food and suitable denning sites for the approaching winter. The tragedy deepened when Dorothy Williams suffered a massive heart attack on the 4th day after the confrontation. The 73-year-old nurse was found by a neighbor, collapsed in her kitchen while preparing medical supplies she hoped to deliver to Luna's family. The ambulance rushed her to Jackson Memorial Hospital, where doctors delivered the devastating news that decades of high-altitude living and physical stress had finally overwhelmed her cardiac system. Mike sat beside Dot's hospital bed, watching monitors track the irregular rhythm of a heart that had beaten with compassion for 7 decades. Her weathered hands, which had delivered countless babies and healed countless wounds, lay still on the white hospital sheets. When she briefly regained consciousness, her first words were not about her own condition, but about the bear cubs she had helped bring into the world. "The little one," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mechanical sounds of life support equipment. "Promise me you won't let that baby die alone, Mike. Promise me that trust won't be broken." The promise Mike made to a dying woman became another weight on his conscience, especially as reports from unofficial observers indicated that Luna was struggling to provide adequate care for both cubs while finding sufficient food to maintain her own strength for winter hibernation. The larger cub was thriving, but hope continued to weaken, its coordination problems making it increasingly difficult for the youngster to nurse effectively or keep up with its mother's movements. Meanwhile, the media circus that had initially supported Mike's actions began to shift as federal authorities launched a coordinated campaign to discredit his reputation. Anonymous sources within the Park Service leaked stories about previous incidents where Mike had allegedly bent regulations, painting him as a rogue ranger who consistently prioritized emotional impulses over professional judgment. The narrative shifted from heroic rescuer to dangerous maverick whose actions had compromised public safety. Supervisor Davis found himself caught in the crossfire between loyalty to his subordinate and pressure from federal headquarters to distance himself from the incident. His own career hung in the balance, with investigators questioning his decision-making and exploring whether his failure to prevent Mike's actions constituted dereliction of duty. The guilt he had carried for 36 years over Robert Thompson's death now compounded with fresh anguish over potentially destroying Robert's son. The breaking point came when federal investigators discovered the deeper connection between Davis and the Thompson family. Personnel files revealed that Davis had been Robert Thompson's partner the night of the fatal bear attack, information that had somehow been omitted from official reports for over 3 decades. The revelation raised questions about cover-ups, favoritism, and whether Davis's protection of Mike constituted a pattern of compromising federal wildlife policy for personal reasons. Dr. Chen received the devastating news about her medical license review while visiting Dorothy Williams in intensive care. The Wyoming State Veterinary Board, under pressure from federal authorities, had opened an investigation into her conduct during the bear birth, questioning whether her actions had violated professional standards for veterinary practice. The potential loss of her license would end her career permanently, making her divorce-related financial struggles irrelevant compared to the complete destruction of her professional identity. the cascading consequences reached beyond the immediate participants. Rangers Martinez and O'Brien faced internal investigations for their failure to actively prevent Mike's violations of federal protocol. Local residents who had supported the rescue found themselves subjected to increased scrutiny from federal agencies, with some facing harassment that seemed designed to discourage future civil disobedience against wildlife management policies. Luna herself became a tragic figure in the unfolding drama. Researchers monitoring her family noted increasing signs of stress as the mother bear struggled to care for her disabled cub while preparing for winter hibernation. Hope's condition continued to deteriorate, with the youngster displaying obvious neurological problems that made survival increasingly unlikely. Wildlife biologists grimly predicted that natural selection would resolve the situation within weeks, sparing federal authorities the need to make difficult decisions about intervention. The financial destruction was methodical and complete. Mike's legal defense fund, initially supported by public sympathy, dwindled as media attention shifted to other stories and corporate sponsors distanced themselves from controversial political issues. Emma's medical bills, previously manageable through payment plans, became overwhelming without his ranger salary. The modest life insurance policy he had maintained wouldn't cover both legal expenses and outstanding debts, forcing him to contemplate bankruptcy. Sarah Chen's divorce settlement included alimony payments that continued despite her loss of income, creating a financial spiral that threatened to consume her remaining assets. Her ex-husband's attorneys showed no sympathy for her situation, arguing that her involvement in federal violations demonstrated the poor judgment that had contributed to their marriage's failure. The legal battle over modified support payments added another layer of complexity to her already overwhelming circumstances. Dorothy Williams' condition deteriorated steadily despite the best efforts of Jackson Memorial's cardiac team. Her family, scattered across multiple states, gathered for what doctors gently described as end-of-life discussions. The woman who had devoted her retirement to caring for wounded animals and lonely rangers was dying, with her greatest act of compassion being transformed into a federal case study of civilian interference with wildlife management. The ultimate cruelty came when federal investigators began exploring whether the stress of the confrontation had contributed to Dot's heart attack, potentially adding negligent homicide to the charges being considered against Mike. The suggestion that his decision to save bear cubs might have killed the woman who had been his strongest supporter created a guilt that threatened to destroy his sanity along with his career. As autumn advanced toward winter and Hope's condition continued to decline, Mike faced the reality that all his sacrifices might have accomplished nothing more than prolonging the suffering of a disabled cub that nature would claim anyway. The trust Luna had placed in him, the promise he had made to his dying grandfather, the vow he had sworn to Dorothy Williams, all of it seemed meaningless against the cold efficiency of federal bureaucracy and the harsh mathematics of wilderness survival. Standing in the parking lot of Jackson Memorial Hospital, watching Dorothy Williams's life slip away on monitors visible through her window, Mike confronted the possibility that some prices were too high to pay, that some promises extracted too much from those who tried to keep them. The disabled bear cub he had named Hope was dying slowly in the wilderness. The woman who had supported him was dying in a sterile hospital room, and the career that had given his life meaning was already dead. In that moment of absolute despair, with everything he had ever cared about crumbling around him, Mike Thompson began to understand why his father had died alone in the wilderness 36 years earlier. Some acts of compassion demanded everything, leaving nothing behind except the terrible knowledge that love was not enough to protect those who mattered most. The tragedy was complete, but the story was not yet finished. The first revelation came through an unlikely source, a box of yellowed documents that Dorothy Williams' niece discovered while cleaning out her aunt's attic after the funeral. Among Dot's carefully preserved memories from her nursing career were official incident reports, medical records, and correspondence that painted a dramatically different picture of Robert Thompson's death than the sanitized version that had shaped Park Service policy for 36 years. According to Dot's meticulously maintained files, she had been the emergency medical responder called to treat Robert Thompson after the 1987 bear attack. Her nursing notes, written in precise medical terminology, documented injuries consistent with a mauling, but they also included observations that had never appeared in official reports. Most significantly, her records showed that Robert had survived the initial attack and lived for nearly 3 hours, repeatedly asking about the condition of the injured bear he had been trying to save. The documents revealed that Robert Thompson hadn't died as a reckless ranger who violated protocol, but as a man who had successfully treated an injured sow's infected wound before being attacked by a different bear, a territorial male who had been defending his feeding area from perceived intrusion. Dorothy's notes included Robert's dying words, "Tell my boy that sometimes saving one life makes all the difference. Don't let them change the story." This evidence reached Mike through Dorothy's niece, Jennifer Walsh, a civil rights attorney from Denver who had driven to Wyoming for her aunt's funeral and found herself drawn into the federal case by the injustice of the situation. Jennifer's legal expertise immediately recognized the significance of her aunt's documentation, particularly the evidence that official reports had been deliberately altered to support a narrative of ranger misconduct rather than heroic sacrifice. Meanwhile, Dr. Sarah Chen was conducting her own investigation into the historical precedents for human intervention in wildlife medical emergencies. Her research, motivated by the professional review that threatened her veterinary license, uncovered a pattern of selective enforcement that suggested federal authorities routinely ignored successful interventions while publicizing those that resulted in injury or death. Her findings indicated that Mike's actions with Luna were part of a long tradition of wildlife professionals who chose medical necessity over bureaucratic compliance. The most shocking revelation emerged when Jennifer Walsh's legal team subpoenaed personnel records related to the Thompson case investigation. The documents revealed that Supervisor James Davis had not been merely Robert Thompson's partner on the night of the fatal incident. He had been specifically assigned as backup because of concerns about his drinking problem and emotional stability following his divorce. The original investigation had recommended disciplinary action against Davis for abandoning his post, but those recommendations had been buried by supervisors who feared the political implications of acknowledging institutional failures. Davis himself provided the final piece of the puzzle during a private meeting with Jennifer Walsh, his conscience finally overwhelming 3 decades of enforced silence. With tears streaming down his weathered face, he confessed that he had been passed out drunk in his patrol vehicle while Robert Thompson died, calling for backup on a radio that went unanswered. The guilt had shaped every decision Davis had made since that night, including his harsh enforcement of regulations that he believed might prevent another tragedy. "I've spent 36 years trying to save Mike from his father's fate," Davis admitted, his voice breaking with emotion. "Every strict rule, every harsh disciplinary action, every time I stopped him from taking risks, I thought I was protecting him, but I was just punishing him for my own failure to be there when his father needed me." The revelation transformed the legal landscape surrounding Mike's case. Jennifer Walsh immediately filed motions challenging the legitimacy of disciplinary proceedings based on policies created to cover up institutional misconduct. Her legal arguments, framed Mike's actions not as violations of sound regulations, but as corrections to policies that had been distorted by guilt and cover-up rather than genuine safety concerns. Public opinion shifted dramatically when Dorothy Williams's documentation became public through strategic media leaks orchestrated by Jennifer's legal team. The narrative of Mike as a reckless ranger was replaced by the story of a third-generation wildlife protector whose family had repeatedly sacrificed everything for their commitment to preserving life. Social media campaigns exploded with support, while environmental groups and veterinary associations rallied to defend both Mike and Dr. Chen. The pressure on federal authorities intensified when Thomas Crow Feather, the Shoshone elder who had intervened during the original confrontation, announced that his tribal council was prepared to assert sovereignty claims over the area where Luna had given birth. His legal argument, supported by 19th-century treaty language, contended that federal wildlife management policies that prohibited life-saving medical intervention violated indigenous spiritual practices that viewed such healing as sacred obligation. Dr. Chen's veterinary license review was abruptly suspended when the Wyoming Veterinary Board received a flood of supporting testimony from colleagues nationwide. Prominent veterinary schools offered her research positions, while animal rights organizations established legal defense funds to protect her from federal retaliation. The professional community that had initially distanced itself from the controversy now embraced her as a symbol of medical ethics triumphing over bureaucratic interference. But the most powerful revelation concerned Luna herself. Wildlife researchers analyzing months of behavioral data discovered evidence that Luna had been deliberately leading her cubs toward areas with higher human activity, particularly near the sites where park rangers conducted routine patrols. Her behavior suggested an unprecedented level of trust in human assistance that challenged fundamental assumptions about wild animal psychology and the effects of early human contact on wildlife development. The research team's most startling finding concerned Hope, the disabled cub whose condition had been steadily declining. Detailed observation revealed that Luna was not abandoning her weaker offspring, as wildlife biologists had predicted, but was instead modifying her behavior to accommodate Hope's limitations. She shortened her daily movements, selected denning sites with easier access, and even appeared to be teaching her stronger cub to assist his sibling during challenging terrain. These observations reached Mike through an unexpected source. Martinez and O'Brien, the two rangers who had witnessed the original birth but had since been conducting unofficial monitoring of Luna's family. Their guilt over their failure to support Mike had motivated them to document Luna's remarkable adaptation to Hope's special needs, creating a record that demonstrated the profound bond between mother and cubs that Mike's intervention had preserved. The behavioral documentation provided scientific justification for what Mike had known intuitively: that Luna's trust in humans represented a unique opportunity to study interspecies cooperation rather than a dangerous breakdown of natural barriers. Researchers from multiple universities petitioned federal authorities for permission to conduct formal studies of Luna's family, arguing that the relationship Mike had fostered could provide unprecedented insights into wildlife psychology and human-animal communication. Jennifer Walsh's legal strategy culminated in a federal court filing that challenged not just the disciplinary actions against Mike, but the entire framework of wildlife management policies that prohibited emergency medical intervention. Her arguments drew on constitutional principles, scientific evidence, and indigenous rights claims to construct a case that federal authorities could not easily dismiss or contain through administrative procedures. The turning point came when Luna herself provided the most compelling evidence for Mike's vindication. During a routine monitoring session, researchers observed Hope successfully keeping pace with his mother and sibling for the first time since birth. His coordination and strength dramatically improved through what appeared to be intensive maternal therapy adapted to his specific limitations. The sight of the disabled cub thriving under Luna's modified care provided visual proof that Mike's intervention had saved not just 3 lives, but had preserved a family unit capable of adapting to extraordinary challenges. Federal authorities found themselves facing a perfect storm of legal challenges, scientific evidence, public pressure, and political complications that made continued prosecution of Mike's case increasingly untenable. Director Hayes, who had initially driven the disciplinary proceedings with ruthless efficiency, now confronted the possibility that her aggressive pursuit of punishment had created a national symbol of bureaucratic overreach that threatened to undermine federal environmental policies across multiple agencies. The final revelation came when Jennifer Walsh's team uncovered evidence that the Department of Interior had been using Mike's case as a test case for expanded enforcement powers that would limit public access to federal lands and reduce opportunities for citizen involvement in wildlife management. The political implications of this discovery transformed Mike's personal struggle into a broader fight over democratic participation in environmental protection, attracting support from across the political spectrum. As autumn progressed toward winter and Luna prepared her family for hibernation, the pieces of a complex puzzle were falling into place. The truth about Robert Thompson's death, the reality of institutional cover-ups, the evidence of Luna's extraordinary adaptation, and the broader implications of federal overreach had created a foundation for vindication that seemed impossible just months earlier. But the most important truth remained to be revealed, a secret that would transform understanding not just of Mike's actions, but of the profound connections that could exist between humans and the wild creatures they were meant to protect. The vindication came not with fanfare, but with a simple phone call on a crisp October morning, as Mike sat in the tiny Jackson Hole apartment he could barely afford, watching the sunrise paint the Tetons gold. Jennifer Walsh's voice carried quiet triumph as she delivered news that would restore everything he had lost and more. The Secretary of Interior himself signed the reinstatement order, Mike. Full back pay, complete pension restoration, and a formal apology from the department. You're not just getting your job back, they're creating a new position for you as Special Advisor for Human-Wildlife Relations. The federal reversal was complete and unprecedented. Director Hayes, facing congressional investigation into her handling of the case, had quietly resigned rather than endure public hearings that would have exposed decades of misguided policies. In her place came Dr. Maria Santos, a wildlife biologist whose first official act was to establish new protocols that recognized emergency medical intervention as both scientifically valid and morally necessary when conducted by qualified professionals. Supervisor James Davis received his own form of redemption when the department offered him early retirement with full benefits and a commendation for his 36 years of service. But Davis declined the comfortable exit, choosing instead to remain as Mike's direct supervisor and to help implement the new policies that would honor Robert Thompson's memory by protecting both wildlife and the rangers who served them. "I owe it to your father," he told Mike during their first meeting after the reinstatement, "and I owe it to every ranger who's faced the choice between following their heart and following orders." Dr. Sarah Chen's professional resurrection was equally dramatic. Not only was the Veterinary Review Board investigation dismissed, but she received offers from 3 major universities to head new programs in wildlife emergency medicine. She accepted a joint position with the University of Wyoming and the National Park Service that would allow her to develop training protocols for rangers facing medical emergencies in the field. Her first act was to establish the Dorothy Williams Memorial Fund for Wildlife Emergency Care, ensuring that Dot's legacy would continue saving lives long after her death. The most remarkable transformation belonged to Luna herself. As winter approached and the bears prepared for hibernation, researchers documented what they described as revolutionary evidence of adaptive maternal behavior in wild grizzlies. Luna had not only successfully accommodated Hope's disabilities, but had taught her stronger cub, whom researchers named Courage, to assist his sibling in ways that defied traditional understanding of bear family dynamics. The disabled cub was not only surviving, but thriving, his coordination and strength improving daily through his mother's patient guidance. Mike's first official act upon reinstatement was to establish permanent protection for Luna's family territory, designating the area around Cascade Creek as a restricted research zone where human interference would be minimal, but emergency medical assistance would be available if needed. The designation honored both the bears' need for wild autonomy and the trust relationship that had made their survival possible. The wedding took place on a golden September afternoon, exactly 1 year after Luna's cubs were born, in the same clearing where Mike had made his career-defining choice. Sarah Chen had accepted his proposal with tears of joy, understanding that their love had been forged in the crucible of shared sacrifice and mutual respect for the sacredness of life. Thomas Crow. Feather performed the ceremony, blending Cherokee traditions Mike had learned from his grandfather with contemporary vows that honored both their professional partnership and personal devotion. Dorothy Williams was represented by her favorite rocking chair, transported from her ranch and decorated with wildflowers by the dozens of local residents whose lives she had touched. Her spirit seemed to bless the proceedings as Jennifer Walsh, now a close family friend, read from Dot's journals. Love multiplies when it's shared, never divides. Every act of kindness creates ripples that touch shores we'll never see. The guest list reflected the community that had rallied around Mike's choice. Retired rangers who had driven from across the country, veterinarians from multiple states, and local ranchers who understood that protecting wildlife meant protecting the land they all shared. Davis served as best man, his presence symbolizing the healing that had emerged from decades of buried guilt and the power of forgiveness to transform even the deepest wounds. Luna herself provided the ceremony's most magical moment. As the couple exchanged vows, the massive grizzly appeared at the tree line with her 2 cubs, now nearly grown and healthy beyond all expectations. Hope, his coordination vastly improved, actually took several steps toward the gathering before his mother gently guided him back to the forest's edge. Their brief appearance felt like a blessing from the wilderness itself, acknowledging the bond that had brought them all together. The reception took place at Dot Williams's ranch, now donated to the county as a wildlife rehabilitation center that would serve the region for generations. Mike's speech thanked everyone who had supported their struggle, but his deepest gratitude was reserved for the woman whose absence filled the gathering with bittersweet emotion. Dot taught me that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken, he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. It's about creating connections that make us all stronger. Dr. Chen announced that her research with Luna's family had already yielded insights that would revolutionize wildlife emergency medicine. The behavioral adaptations Luna had developed for Hope's care were being studied by researchers worldwide, providing new understanding of how maternal instincts could overcome seemingly insurmountable biological challenges. Love, she told the gathering, is apparently a more powerful force than we ever imagined. The financial restoration was complete, but almost irrelevant compared to the deeper healing that had occurred. Mike's back pay covered Emma's remaining medical debts, while his new position came with a salary increase that reflected the unique value of his expertise. Sarah's university appointment provided both financial security and professional fulfillment, allowing her to pursue research that would save countless animal lives in the future. but the true measure of their victory was visible in the transformed landscape of federal wildlife policy. The Thompson Protocols, named in honor of both Mike and his father, established clear guidelines for emergency intervention while maintaining appropriate safety standards. Rangers across the national park system would now receive training in wildlife emergency medicine, ensuring that future Mike Thompsons wouldn't have to choose between their careers and their consciences. As the celebration continued into the evening, Mike and Sarah walked to the edge of Dot's property, where the lights of their wedding reception twinkled behind them and the vast darkness of Yellowstone stretched ahead. Somewhere in that wilderness, Luna was preparing her family for their first winter hibernation, secure in the knowledge that hope would survive because trust had been honored and love had proven stronger than fear. "Do you think we'll see them again?" Sarah asked, her hand warm in Mike's, as they stood at the boundary between the human world and the wild spaces that had brought them together. Mike smiled, remembering his grandfather's teaching that some bonds transcend the boundaries between species, that some truths endure beyond the limits of human understanding. "I think Luna will find us when she needs us," he said softly. "And until then, we'll be here, ready to honor whatever trust she places in us." Above them, the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, their ancient light blessing a love born from courage, sustained by sacrifice, and destined to protect the wild creatures who had made their union possible. In the distance, a bear's gentle call echoed across the valley, Luna's voice carrying her own blessing to the humans who had chosen compassion over compliance, love over law, and hope over fear. Some promises, Mike thought as he held his wife close, were worth everything they cost to keep. Sometimes life asks us to choose between what's safe and what's right, between following rules and following our hearts. Mike Thompson faced that choice when he risked everything, his career, his pension, his future, to save a struggling mother bear and her cubs. At 46, with just 5 years left until retirement, he could have played it safe, followed protocol, and watched 3 innocent lives slip away. Instead, he remembered what his grandfather taught him, that some bonds transcend species, some truths matter more than regulations, and sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to honor what's truly sacred. This story reminds us that our golden years aren't about playing it safe. They're about using the wisdom we've earned to make choices that matter. Like Mike, many of us have reached the stage where we understand that careers end, but character endures, that pensions provide security, but purpose provides meaning, that the relationships we build with family, community, even the natural world around us are worth more than any bureaucratic approval. The greatest tragedy isn't failing to follow the rules, it's failing to act when love calls us to something greater than ourselves. What moment in your life required you to choose courage over comfort? Have you ever had to risk something important to protect what you truly valued? Please share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else facing their own impossible choice.